What would you do if someone you trusted for 30 years threw away the evidence before you could prove your innocence? This is the story of a Kansas farmer who answered that question, and his quiet response cost a business everything. May 2009, Sterling, Kansas. The heat already climbing past 85 degrees at 9 in the morning, the kind of dry prairie heat that makes metal too hot to touch and turns dust into a fine powder that settles on everything. Robert Williams guided his 2005 Case YHMX 255 Magnum into the service bay at Morrison Equipment, the only Case IH dealer within 73 miles of his farm. The tractor had 4,100 hours on it. The transmission had started slipping in fourth gear 2 weeks earlier, and now it wouldn't hold power past 1,800 RPM under load. Bob was 58 years old, third-generation farmer skin, weathered by 5 decades of sun and wind. His hands on the steering wheel showed the permanent stains of hydraulic fluid and grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He'd bought this tractor new in April 2005 for $87,400, financed it through Case IH credit, made every payment on time the same way he'd made every payment on every piece of equipment he'd ever owned. The warranty was still active 5 years or 5,000 hours, whichever came first. He was 11 months and 900 hours inside that window. Donald Thomas walked around the tractor twice. Service manager, 43 years old, worked at Morrison for 12 years. He asked Bob how he'd been running it, listened to the engine note, checked the hour meter, then told him to leave it overnight. Bob drove home in his pickup, the cab silent except for the rattle of loose tools in the bed and the hum of tires on asphalt. 3 days later, Morrison Equipment called with news that would change everything. The Williams family had farmed the same 1,800 acres for 3 generations. Bob's father, William Williams, had run International Harvester Equipment through the 1960s and 70s, a fleet of IH-7 06s and 1 206s that still sat in the back shed, rusted but never sold monuments to a different era, when a handshake meant something and a dealer's word carried weight. William had taught Bob something that stuck. Equipment is just metal, but a handshake with the right dealer is worth more than any warranty paper. When Case and International Harvester merged in 1985, William stayed loyal. John Deere had offered better trade-in value on his aging 1 206, but William chose the Case IH-7 140 Magnum instead. Not because of horsepower claims or paint color or brand identity. He stayed because Sterling Implement, what Morrison Equipment was called back then, had been fair. They'd honored warranties without argument. They'd delivered parts on time, sometimes driving them out to the farm themselves. When William couldn't afford the downtime, they'd sent mechanics at 7 on a Saturday morning when a planter broke down during spring rush. That fairness had been worth something. It had been worth staying. When Bob took over the farm in 1995, he kept that loyalty. His first major purchase was a 1996 Case IH Magnum 714-0, the same model his father had bought 11 years earlier. Over the next 14 years, Bob bought 10 more machines from Morrison Equipment, 2 combines, 4 tractors, 3 planters, a disc ripper, a grain cart, total value over 30 years, $412,000. In all that time, he'd never had a warranty claim denied, never missed a payment, never raised his voice in their showroom. The night before, Bob brought the MX-255 to Morrison. The Williams family sat down to dinner at their kitchen table. Susan Williams, 56, Bob's wife of 33 years, had been a teacher at Sterling Elementary until her retirement in 2007. She managed the farm's finances with the same careful attention she'd once given to her third-grade lesson plans, tracking every expense in ledgers that dated back to their wedding year. She could read Bob's moods the way she'd once read struggling students, the subtle shifts in posture, the way his jaw tightened when he was worried but didn't want to say it. Jason Williams, 24. Their only child had graduated from Kansas State University in 2007 with a degree in agricultural economics. He'd come back to the farm full-time in 2008, working alongside his father, learning the rhythm of planting and harvest, the economics of commodity markets, the 100 small decisions that add up to a successful season or a failing one. He was eager, full of ideas from university, sometimes impatient with his father's slower, more deliberate approach. Susan set a plate of roast chicken and potatoes on the table. Jason was already scrolling through something on his phone. Bob sat quiet, his usual appetite absent. He pushed food around his plate, took 2 bites, then set his fork down. Susan caught it immediately. 33 years of marriage had taught her when something was wrong. "The transmission's getting worse, isn't it?" Bob nodded once. "Taking it to Morrison tomorrow morning." Jason looked up from his phone. His voice carried the confidence of someone who'd spent 4 years studying business models and efficiency metrics. "Dad, maybe we should check out that new deer dealer in Hutchinson. I heard they've got better service times. Morrison's been getting slow lately." Bob's jaw tightened just slightly. "Morrison's been fair to this family for 30 years. We don't jump ship at the first sign of trouble." Jason opened his mouth to argue, then caught his mother's look and went back to his phone. What Bob didn't say, what he couldn't have known sitting at that dinner table, was that the Morrison equipment he trusted had changed. The dealership his father had shaken hands with in 1979, the place that had delivered a Steiger on a Saturday morning in 2003. Because Bob needed it by Monday, the service department that had always put customers first, that business existed now only in memory. The man who would make the decision about Bob's transmission wasn't thinking about 30 years of loyalty. He was thinking about a corporate directive to reduce warranty claims and an $8,400 repair that would count against his department's quarterly numbers. Bob brought the MX-255 in at 8:30 the next morning. Donald Thomas did his walk-around, asked his questions, promised to call with an update. Bob drove home and waited. Day 1 passed. No call. Day 2, Bob called Morrison. The receptionist put him through to the service department. "We're still looking at it, Mr. Williams. Should have something tomorrow." Day 3, Wednesday morning. Bob was checking irrigation lines in the North Quarter when his cell phone rang. He recognized the number. Morrison Equipment. "Mr. Williams, this is Donald. I've got news about your MX-255. Bob felt something shift in his chest, an instinct honed by 5 decades of dealing with machinery and the men who fixed it. The tone was wrong, too careful, too rehearsed. "The transmission failure isn't covered under warranty." The words hung in the humid air. Bob stopped walking, stood still, in the middle of the field, dust settling on his boots. "Why not?" "Operator abuse. Running 4th gear under heavy load without proper downshifting. The damage is consistent with that kind of misuse." Bob's voice stayed level. "What kind of damage specifically?" "Internal clutch plates burned out. Synchronizer teeth stripped. It's an $11,300 repair." "I need to see the damaged parts." A pause on the line. Just half a second, but Bob caught it. "We had to dispose of them, Mr. Williams. Standard procedure once we determine the cause of failure." Bob's grip tightened on the phone. "You threw them away before I could see them." The mechanic made the call. It was clearly abuse. "We need to maintain shop efficiency, and damaged parts take up valuable space." "When did you throw them away?" "Yesterday afternoon." Bob stood in that field phone pressed to his ear and understood something fundamental had broken. Not just the transmission, something larger. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. The drive to Morrison Equipment took 37 minutes. Bob didn't speed. He didn't rehearse what he was going to say. He just drove hands steady on the wheel, mind working through the mathematics of what he'd just been told. 4-year-old tractor, 4,100 hours, perfect maintenance records, every service done on schedule, every fluid changed, every filter replaced. He had the logs to prove it, sitting in a filing cabinet in his office, 30 years of documentation for every machine he'd ever owned. Morrison Equipment's showroom was exactly as he remembered it. Bright fluorescent lights, new Magnum tractors lined up like soldiers, fresh paint gleaming. Brochures fanned out on the counter, the smell of coffee from the waiting area mixed with the metallic scent of new machinery. Bob had stood in this room dozens of times over 3 decades. He'd signed purchase agreements here, shaken hands with salesmen, picked up parts, brought in machines for service. Donald Thomas was waiting near the service counter, a manila folder in his hands. Probably the work order, though Bob noticed it looked thin, too thin for a detailed mechanical analysis of a transmission failure. Bob didn't raise his voice. 30 years in farming had taught him that loud didn't mean effective. He kept his tone conversational, almost friendly. "Donald, how long have you known me?" 12 years, Mr. Williams, since I started here in '97. "In those 12 years, have I ever brought you a machine I'd abused?" Donald shifted his weight. "No, sir, you haven't." "Have I ever asked you to cover something that wasn't under warranty?" "No, sir." "Have I ever been late on a payment, or missed a service appointment, or given you any reason to think I don't take care of my equipment?" "No, sir." Bob let the silence stretch. 3 seconds, 5, 10. Donald looked down at the folder in his hands. "Then why would I start now?" Donald's response came out memorized, the kind of line someone had fed him in a meeting or over the phone with corporate. "The decision's been made based on the mechanic's assessment. We have to trust our technician's expertise." Bob looked past Donald into the showroom. He could see exactly where he'd stood in March 1996 when he'd signed the papers for his first Magnum. Right there by that same counter, shaking hands with the sales manager who'd retired 5 years ago. He remembered picking up that 2003 Steiger, the one Morrison had delivered on a Saturday, because Bob needed it for Monday planting. He remembered the 2006 planter delivery, how they'd thrown in extra row units worth $2,400 because Bob was a loyal customer and they took care of their own. All of it felt very far away now. Bob's voice stayed quiet. "I'll pay the bill." Donald's shoulders relaxed. Relief washed across his face. "I appreciate that, Mr. Williams. We can have it ready by Friday." "I'll pick it up Monday. I need time to get the check." "Of course. Monday works fine." Bob turned and walked out without another word. He didn't slam the door, didn't make a scene, just walked across the parking lot to his truck, climbed in, and sat there for a full minute before starting the engine. Donald Thomas stood in the service department and felt good about how that conversation had gone. Clean. Professional. The customer had accepted the decision, $11,300 in billable repair work. More importantly, $8,400 saved on a warranty claim that corporate had been pressuring them to avoid. The regional office had sent a memo 3 months ago about rising warranty costs, urging dealers to scrutinize claims more carefully to push back on marginal cases. This had been a marginal case, at least. That's what Donald told himself. A marginal case that could have gone either way, and they'd made the call that protected the dealership's numbers. What Donald didn't know, standing there in the air-conditioned service bay, was that Bob Williams was planning something that weekend. Something quiet. Something that would cost Morrison Equipment more than they'd saved in 100 warranty denials. Saturday morning broke hot and still. Bob woke at 5, same as always, made coffee, and walked out to the old shed behind the house, the shed where his father's International Harvester equipment still sat unchanged since William's death 7 years ago. The 706. The 1206. Paint faded to ghosts of their original colors, rubber-rotted metal oxidized to a deep rust orange. Bob had never sold them, couldn't quite bring himself to let them go even though they'd been obsolete for decades. He sat on an overturned bucket and looked at the machines his father had trusted. Remembered being 14 years old, riding in the cab of that 1206 while William worked a 40-acre wheat field. Remembered his father's hands on the controls, worn and confident, the same hands that had signed papers at Sterling Implement year after year because a dealer's word had meant something. Susan found him there at 6:15. She'd put on jeans and an old KSU sweatshirt, carried 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one, then sat on another bucket close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They sat in silence for 15 minutes. No words, just the morning sounds of the farm, waking up birds in the cottonwoods wind, moving through the equipment shed, the distant hum of the highway 2 miles south. Finally, Susan spoke. Her voice carried no surprise, no shock, just recognition of something she'd already figured out. "You're going to sell it all, aren't you?" Bob nodded. "The MX-255, everything." Susan had been a teacher for 28 years. She'd learned to recognize decisions that had already been made, the moments when arguing was pointless because the conclusion was already drawn. This was one of those moments, but she asked the practical questions anyway because that was her role. The bookkeeper, the one who looked at numbers and saw consequences. "We'll lose money. Equipment's worth less than we paid." "I know. You'll have to buy used from somewhere else. Maybe pay more than these machines are worth." "I know. Donald Thomas will know why you did it." Bob's voice didn't change, stayed level, calm, almost matter-of-fact. "Good." Susan sipped her coffee, studied her husband's profile in the early light. She'd known him since she was 19, married him at 23, watched him take over this farm and build it into something stable and productive. She'd seen him make hard decisions before, which fields to plant, which equipment to buy, when to hold grain and when to sell. But she'd never seen him this calm about something this big. Usually, major decisions came with tension, worry, long nights of discussing pros and cons. This decision had a different quality. It felt final in a way that scared her and reassured her at the same time. "Bob, in 33 years, I've never seen you this settled about something this expensive. Why aren't you angry?" He turned to look at her. "I am angry, but anger isn't the point. The point is they threw away the evidence because they didn't want me to fight them. They wanted me to accept their decision and move on. That tells me everything I need to know about what 30 years of loyalty is worth to them." The words hung between them, Susan understood then. This wasn't about money or equipment or even the warranty claim. This was about respect, about discovering that a relationship she'd watched her husband's father build over decades, that Bob had maintained for 30 more years, had turned out to be conditional. And the conditions had nothing to do with loyalty or fairness or keeping your word. The conditions were measured in quarterly profit margins and warranty claim percentages and corporate directives from some office in Wisconsin that had never met Bob Williams and didn't care about the handshake his father had made in 1979. Sunday afternoon, Bob called Jeffrey Lewis, an auctioneer out of Hutchinson he'd bought equipment from twice over the years. Jeff had a reputation for fair estimates and bringing in good crowds. His voice came through the phone friendly, relaxed. "Bob Williams, been a while. What can I do for you?" Bob stood in his office looking at the maintenance logs filed in careful chronological order. 30 years of documentation, every oil change, every repair, every part replaced. "I need to sell my entire Case IH line." A pause. Then Jeff's voice came back more careful. "All of it, Bob. I remember your operation. You've got, what, 300,000 in equipment there? More, closer to 310 at current book value. You switching brands or getting out of farming?" "Switching!" Another pause. Bob could hear Jeff thinking, calculating, trying to understand. "Can you do July 18th? That's 6 weeks out. You sure about this? That's fast for a sale this size." Bob's hand tightened on the phone. "I've never been more sure of anything." "All right. I'll need an equipment list by Tuesday, photos by Thursday. We'll get a catalog out week of the 22nd. Should bring a good crowd, quality equipment. Always does." Bob hung up and started making the list. MX255, Magnum 2005, 4100 hours. Steiger STX 375 2003, bought used in 2007, 2388. Combine 1998, 2900 separator hours. The 1200 planter, the disc ripper, the grain cart, the field cultivator, 11 machines total, 30 years of Case IH, loyalty, itemized on 2 pages of lined paper. Jason walked into the office just as Bob was finishing the list. He'd been working on the south irrigation line, came in dusty and sweating, grabbed a water bottle from the mini-fridge Bob kept by the desk. He noticed the list, the equipment names written in his father's careful block letters. "Dad, what are you doing?" Bob didn't look up, just kept writing. "What I should have done the minute they told me they threw away the parts." Jason's voice rose, confusion mixing with something close to panic. "But we need that equipment for harvest. We're 4 months out. You can't just sell everything." "We'll have different equipment by harvest. Same work, different paint." "Different from where you've bought Case IH for 30 years. Every dealer around here knows us as a Case IH operation." "What are you switching to?" Bob set down his pen, looked at his son. 24 years old, college degree, full of ideas about efficiency and margins and best practices. But Jason hadn't been there in the Morrison showroom, hadn't heard Donald Thomas's voice when he said the parts had been thrown away, hadn't felt the moment when 30 years of trust turned out to be worth exactly nothing against an $8,400 warranty claim. "I don't know yet, but I know it won't be Case IH, and it won't be from Morrison Equipment." Jason opened his mouth to argue, saw his father's face, closed his mouth, walked out of the office without another word. Monday morning, June 2nd. Bob drove to Morrison Equipment with a check for $11,300. He'd written it out the night before, careful numbers in blue ink. The MX255 was waiting in the parking lot, transmission repaired, washed, and ready. Donald Thomas had the paperwork prepared. Bob signed, handed over the check, climbed into the cab, and drove the tractor home. That was it. No speeches, no explanations, just a transaction, a customer paying a bill. The auction catalog went out the following week. Morrison Equipment heard about it the same day the first catalogs hit mailboxes. Kenneth Lee, the sales manager, called Bob's cell phone that Wednesday afternoon. Bob was in the field, running the MX-255. The transmission worked perfectly. Now smooth and strong, exactly the way it should have worked before it failed. Exactly the way it would have worked if the failure had been a manufacturing defect instead of operator abuse. Kenneth's voice came through friendly, concerned. "Bob, I heard you're selling equipment. Is there a problem? Something we should know about?" "No problem." "Are you getting out of farming? Because if you need to restructure financing, we can work with you. You've been a good customer for a long time." "Not getting out? Then why the sale? If you're looking to upgrade, we've got some great trade-in deals on the new Magnums, better than auction prices." Bob let the silence stretch. 3 seconds, 5. Then the auctions firm Kenneth. "I appreciate the call." He hung up, went back to work. The catalog was already in circulation. 140 copies mailed to farmers and dealers across 3 counties. Most people who saw it recognized Bob's name, knew his reputation for maintaining equipment, and understood that when a farmer like Bob Williams sold good machines, there was usually a reason. Morrison Equipment didn't send anyone to the July 18th sale. They knew it was happening. The whole county knew, but no one from the dealership showed up. Maybe they thought it would be awkward. Maybe they didn't want to see what they'd lost. Maybe they figured one customer selling his equipment didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. They were wrong about that last part. 140 people showed up to Bob Williams's farm that Saturday. Most of them were farmers. Some were dealers from 2 counties over looking for equipment they could resell. And 18 of them were farmers who had been buying from Morrison Equipment for 15 to 35 years, men in their 50s and 60s who had watched Bob and his father build a reputation for fair dealing and careful stewardship. They came to see what would happen when 30 years of loyalty met an $11,300 warranty denial. They didn't come to buy. They came to watch and to remember. Word count 3,817 plus, continuing to reach 5,500 to 6,200. The morning of July 18th broke clear and hot temperature, already pushing 90 degrees by 9 when Jeffrey Lewis arrived to set up. Bob had arranged the equipment in a long line across the front yard, 11 machines positioned so bidders could walk around them, inspect them, see exactly what they were getting. Everything washed, tires aired up, hour meters visible, maintenance logs laid out on a folding table near the house available for anyone who wanted to verify the service history. Susan stood on the front porch, watching cars and trucks turn into the driveway. More than she'd expected. Word had spread beyond the catalog mailing. Farmers talked to each other at the co-op, at the grain elevator, over coffee at the diner in Sterling. By the time the sale started, there were vehicles parked along the county road for a quarter mile in both directions. Jason moved through the crowd, answering questions about equipment specifications, pointing people toward the maintenance logs. He'd been quiet all week, processing what his father was doing. Now, he just focused on the task at hand, making sure potential buyers had the information they needed. Among the crowd, Bob noticed faces he recognized. Timothy Clark, 61, farmed 1,200 acres north of Sterling. Bob had known him for 20 years. Timothy ran Case 1H equipment, bought it all from Morrison. He stood near the MX-255 for a long time, ran his hand along the hood, checked the hour meter, but didn't talk to anyone, just observed. James Smith, 55, 2,400 acres, Case YH customer since the early 80s. He showed up with his son, walked the line of equipment twice, asked Jeffrey Lewis a single quiet question. What really happened with the warranty? Jeffrey had looked uncomfortable and said that wasn't his place to share. 16 other farmers Bob recognized from Morrison's customer base. They didn't cluster together, didn't make it obvious they knew each other, but they were there and they were watching, and Bob understood what they were doing. They were gathering data, collecting evidence, making a calculation about whether what happened to Bob Williams could happen to them. Jeffrey started the auction at 10 sharp. His voice carried across the yard, amplified through speakers mounted on his truck. He opened with the smaller implements, the grain cart, the field cultivator, some toolbar attachments, got the crowd warmed up, established the bidding rhythm. Then he moved to the MX-255, the tractor that had started everything, 4 years old, 4,100 hours, transmission just rebuilt, book value $68,000. In a normal market with a normal seller, it should have brought at least $60,000. Maybe more, given the low hours and recent service. Jeffrey opened bidding at $45,000. A hand went up, $47,000. Another hand, $49,000. The bidding moved slowly, cautiously. Farmers in the crowd knew this tractor's history, knew about the warranty denial. Some of them wondered if there was something wrong with it that Bob wasn't sharing. Others just felt uncomfortable bidding on equipment that represented a broken relationship. The bidding stalled at $52,000. Jeffrey worked the crowd, tried to push it higher, $52,500. And it won $52,500. Sold at $52,000 to buyer number 47. A farmer from Nebraska. He'd driven 3 hours because the price was right, and he didn't know the backstory. He just saw a good tractor at $16,000 below book value. The 2003 Steiger should have brought $115,000. It sold for $91,000. The 1998 Combine should have brought $52,000. It sold for $38,000. Down the line, every piece of equipment sold below book value, some way below. By the time Jeffrey wrapped up at $130, the total was in, $310,000. After his commission of $15,500 and the loan payoffs of $190,500. Bob cleared $104,000. He'd lost nearly $100,000 in depreciation, auction fees, and below-market prices. He stood in his yard and watched the equipment roll away on trailers driven by farmers he'd never met, headed to operations he'd never see. 30 years of Case IH loyalty dispersed across 3 states in a single afternoon. Jason found him standing alone near the shed. "Dad, we just lost almost $100,000. Bob watched the last trailer pull out onto the county road. "No, we just found out what Morrison Equipment thinks we're worth, and now everyone else knows too." The 18 farmers who had come to observe didn't talk to Bob, didn't approach him or ask questions or offer condolences. They just watched the numbers come in, watched equipment sell below value, and understood the message. A 58-year-old farmer with 30 years of loyalty had just taken a $100,000 loss to make a point. The point was clear: when trust breaks, nothing else matters. Not convenience, not history, not 30 years of handshakes and fair dealing. By the time the sun set that evening, the story had already started to spread. Not through social media or online forums. This was rural Kansas in 2009, where news still traveled the old ways. over coffee at the grain elevator, in conversations at the co-op during parts runs, at the diner in Sterling where farmers met for breakfast before heading to their fields. The story's details varied depending on who was telling it. Some said Bob had been running wrong hydraulic fluid. Some said he'd been pulling too heavy in wet conditions. Some said the dealership claimed he'd been shifting incorrectly. But the core facts never changed. A 58-year-old farmer with 30 years of loyalty, a 4-year-old tractor with 4,100 hours, a warranty denial with no documentation, parts thrown away before the customer could inspect them, an $11,300 repair bill, and then the auction, the quiet, methodical dismantling of a 3-decade relationship. Every farmer who heard the story asked themselves the same question: what would I have done? And most of them, being honest with themselves, arrived at the same answer Bob Williams had reached. When someone throws away the evidence, they're telling you they don't want you to fight. They're telling you that your 30 years don't matter as much as their $8,400. They're telling you exactly what you're worth to them. The question became, what are you going to do with that information? Timothy Clark would answer that question by late August. James Smith would answer it in October. 13 others would answer it over the following 6 months. Their answers would all be different in detail, but identical in substance. They would stop coming to Morrison Equipment, stop bringing their machines in for service, stop calling about parts, stop considering new equipment from the dealership that had been their source for decades. They wouldn't argue, wouldn't file complaints, wouldn't write letters or make scenes. They would just quietly stop showing up. And when Morrison called to follow up on trade-in offers or service reminders, they would give the same polite, non-committal answer. "We're good. We'll call if we need anything." And they would never call. But that part of the story was still weeks and months away. On the evening of July 18th, Bob Williams sat on his porch with Susan watching the sun drop toward the western horizon. The yard was empty now, except for dust settling where trailers had been parked tire tracks in the grass auction signs waiting to be taken down. Jason was inside, probably online, researching John Deere dealers and used equipment auctions, making lists of what they needed to replace, calculating costs, trying to figure out how to keep the farm operational through harvest with $100,000 less than they should have had. Susan didn't ask if Bob regretted it. She knew he didn't, could see it in the way he sat relaxed in a way he hadn't been for weeks. The decision was made. The action was taken. Whatever came next, at least, it would be on terms he'd chosen, instead of terms dictated by a dealership that had measured his loyalty in dollars and found it wanting. "Donald Thomas probably thinks he did the right thing," Susan said quietly. Bob nodded. "Probably does. Saved the dealership $8,400, protected his warranty budget, made the numbers work out the way corporate wanted. From his perspective, it was a good business decision. From our perspective—" Bob looked out at the empty yard. "From our perspective, he just taught every farmer in 3 counties what Morrison Equipment's word is worth, and that's going to cost them more than they saved." The light faded. Shadows stretched across the farm. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dry wheat fields and sun-baked earth. Inside the house, the phone rang. Jason answered. His voice drifted out through the screen door. "Yeah, we're doing okay. Thanks for calling. No, I don't think Dad wants to talk about it right now. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'll tell him." He hung up, came out to the porch. "That was Mark Anderson, the John Deere dealer in Hutchinson. Says he heard about the sale. Wanted to know if we'd be interested in looking at some used equipment he's got coming in next week." He sounded different, not like a sales call, more like he was just being respectful. Bob considered that. Mark Anderson had been trying to get Case IH customers to switch to Deere for a decade. Usually his approach was aggressive, all talk about better resale value and superior engineering. If he was calling now with a softer touch, it meant he understood what had happened. Understood that this wasn't about chasing deals or making sales pitches. This was about a farmer who'd been betrayed and was looking for someone who wouldn't do the same thing. Tell him we'll stop by Thursday, not making any promises, just looking. Jason nodded and went back inside. Susan reached over and took Bob's hand. You know this is going to get bigger than just us. I know. Other farmers are going to make decisions based on what they saw today. I know that too. Morrison Equipment could lose a lot of customers. Bob squeezed her hand gently. That's not my concern. My concern is making sure we can get through harvest and get the winter wheat in on time. Everything else is Morrison's problem to solve. They sat in silence as full darkness came. Stars appeared overhead, sharp and bright in the clear prairie sky. The kind of night where you could see the Milky Way stretching horizon to horizon, where the universe felt close enough to touch. Somewhere 47 miles away in Hutchinson, Mark Anderson sat in his office at Webb Agricultural Equipment and thought about the phone call he'd just made. He'd been at Bob Williams's auction, hadn't bid on anything, just watched, counted the farmers from Morrison's customer base who'd shown up to observe, listened to the bidding, watched the prices come in below book value, and understood he was witnessing something rare, a customer revolt that wasn't loud or organized or public. Just one farmer making a quiet statement that would ripple outward in ways Morrison Equipment wouldn't understand until it was too late. Mark had been in the equipment business for 23 years. He'd seen dealers rise and fall, seen manufacturers come and go, seen the farm economy boom and crash and recover and crash again. But he'd never seen anything quite like what happened at Bob Williams's farm that day. It had the feel of a turning point, the moment when something fundamental shifted. He made a note to himself to be patient with Bob Williams, not to push, not to sell, just to listen and offer fair prices and keep his word. Because if there was one thing the Williams auction had proven, it was that farmers remembered when you kept your word. And they remembered even longer when you broke it. 94 miles northwest in Sterling, Kansas, Donald Thomas sat in his living room and tried to explain to his wife why he felt uneasy. The warranty denial had been 3 months ago. Bob Williams had paid the bill without arguing. The MX255 was fixed and back on his farm. Everything had worked out exactly as it should have, except Bob had sold every piece of Case IH equipment he owned, and the sale had been public, and farmers from all over had shown up to watch. And Donald had heard from Kenneth Lee that the prices had been terrible, way below book, which meant Bob had taken a huge loss just to make some kind of point. Donald's wife asked what point that was. He couldn't quite articulate it. Something about trust and fairness, and the difference between doing things by the book and doing them right. Something about how saving $8,400 on one warranty claim might cost more than it saved if other customers started wondering whether they'd be treated the same way. But he couldn't say it out loud, because saying it would mean admitting he'd made a mistake. And Donald Thomas wasn't ready to admit that yet. Maybe never would be. So he just said it was complicated and went to bed and tried not to think about the 18 farmers who'd shown up to watch Bob Williams sell 30 years of equipment at a loss. tried not to wonder if any of them were thinking about doing the same thing. Back on the Williams farm, Bob stood at the window of his office and looked out at the empty equipment yard, spaces where the MX-255 had been parked, where the Steiger had sat, where the combine had waited during the off-season, all empty now, just bare ground and grass starting to grow back. In 30 days, he'd go to an auction in Hayes and buy a used John Deere 7810. In 45 days, he'd pick up a 965 combine from a retiring farmer near Salina. By harvest, he'd have a full line of Deere equipment, none of it new, all of it bought at auctions or through private sales. Different paint, different dealer network, different everything. But the farm would keep running. The wheat would still grow. The seasons would still turn. Life would go on just with a different color of machinery in the yard. What Bob didn't know, couldn't have known standing there in the darkness, was that his quiet auction had set something in motion. A slow-moving wave of consequences that would build over the next 18 months and crash down on Morrison equipment with force enough to close their doors forever. All from one denied warranty claim, one decision to throw away evidence, one calculation that $8,400 was worth more than 30 years of trust. The mathematics of loyalty turned out to be more complicated than Donald Thomas had thought, because loyalty isn't measured in single transactions. It's measured in decades, in handshakes and kept promises and fair dealing even when it costs you something. And when you break that loyalty, when you make it clear that a customer's 30 years don't matter as much as your quarterly numbers, you don't just lose that customer, you lose everyone who's watching, everyone who's wondering if they're next, everyone who's asking themselves whether their loyalty is worth anything at all. Bob Williams had answered that question for himself. Now 18 other farmers were beginning to ask it, and over the next 6 months, 13 of them would arrive at the same conclusion Bob had reached, that some things are worth more than money, some things are worth taking a loss to preserve, some things like dignity and self-respect, and the knowledge that you won't accept being treated like you don't matter are worth walking away from 30 years of history to protect. Morrison Equipment would learn that lesson, but by the time they understood what was happening, it would be too late to fix it. The story was just beginning. The week following Bob Williams's auction, the story moved through Sterling and the surrounding counties like groundwater seeping through limestone, slow, invisible, but reaching everywhere. At the grain elevator, farmers waiting in line to drop off wheat loads talked in low voices about the prices Bob's equipment had brought. At the co-op, men picking up parts or chemicals mentioned they'd heard Bob switch to Deere. At the diner on Main Street, breakfast, conversations touched on Morrison equipment and warranty denials, and whether what happened to Bob could happen to anyone. Nobody organized these conversations. Nobody planned them, or directed them, or tried to make them into something bigger. They just happened the way information spreads in rural communities, where everyone knows everyone and trust is currency. Mark Anderson heard about the auction from his sales manager 3 days after it happened. He'd already been there, had already counted the Morrison customers in the crowd, had already understood what he was witnessing, but he listened to his sales manager's excited summary anyway, nodding in the right places, asking careful questions. 17 Case IH machines sold below book. Williams took a bath, must have lost 90,000. Closer to 100, Mark said quietly. His sales manager looked at him. You were there, just observing, Didn't bid on anything? Why not? That MX255 went for 52. You could have flipped it for 65 easy. Mark leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, thinking about the 18 farmers he'd recognized in that crowd, thinking about how they'd stood silent and watchful, not bidding, just gathering information. Because buying Bob Williams's equipment would have sent the wrong message. He wasn't selling because he needed to liquidate. He was selling to make a point. And the point wasn't for us. It was for Morrison's other customers. What point? That loyalty has a breaking point, and Morrison just found Bob's. His sales manager didn't fully understand, which was fine. Mark wasn't trying to explain strategy. He was just stating facts. Over the next 6 months, some of those 18 farmers would start calling Webb agricultural equipment. Not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but enough. And when they called, Mark would be ready, not with aggressive sales pitches or promises he couldn't keep, but with fair prices and straight answers and the kind of service that made customers feel like their business mattered. That was the opportunity Morrison Equipment had handed him. Not through malice or stupidity, just through the kind of corporate thinking that reduced 3 decades of relationship to a single line item on a quarterly report. Late August brought the first confirmation that Mark's analysis was correct. Timothy Clark drove his 2007 Case IH Puma 180 into Morrison Equipment's service bay on a Wednesday afternoon. Routine oil change, nothing complicated, the kind of service he'd been getting from Morrison for 14 years. He'd bought his first Case IH from them in 1995, a Maxim 5 1.3. Oh, that had served him well for a decade before he traded it toward newer equipment. 6 machines total over those 14 years. Never a warranty dispute, never a late payment, never any reason to think about going elsewhere. He parked the tractor and walked into the parts department while the service techs got to work. Richard Miller was behind the counter, same parts manager who'd been there since Timothy started coming to Morrison. They knew each other well enough to skip the formalities. Timothy glanced around to make sure they were alone. "You hear what happened with Bob Williams?" Richard's expression shifted, became more guarded. "I did." "Dealership review the warranty decision." "Not my department." The answer came too fast, too practiced. Timothy had taught high school math for 30 years before taking over his father's farm full-time. He knew what evasion sounded like. Anyone from management reach out to Bob after he sold his equipment? "I don't know." Another non-answer. Timothy nodded slowly, understanding spreading through him like cold water. Morrison Equipment wasn't going to acknowledge what had happened, wasn't going to examine their process or reach out to a 30-year customer who'd just walked away. They were going to pretend it was just business, just one transaction among thousands, nothing to worry about. He paid the $340 for the service, drove the Puma home, sat in his kitchen for an hour, not moving, just thinking. His wife, Margaret, found him there when she came in from the garden. "You all right?" Timothy looked at her. 43 years of marriage meant she could read him as easily as he'd once read struggling students trying to hide that they didn't understand quadratic equations. "I'm switching to deer." Margaret set down her gardening basket, pulled out a chair, sat across from him. "Because of Bob. Because if it happened to Bob after 30 years, it could happen to me after 14, and I'm not going to wait around to find out." Margaret studied his face. She'd been through major decisions with him before buying out his brother's share of the farm in 2001, deciding to retire early from teaching in 2003, investing in new irrigation equipment in 2006. Usually, he agonized over big choices, made lists of pros and cons, talked through scenarios. This decision had a different quality. Final, settled, no second guessing. When called Mark Anderson this morning. He's got a Deere 833 coming in next week. Trade in on the Puma and the 712. Combine. Should be able to work something out. 2 weeks later, Timothy Clark drove away from Webb Agricultural Equipment in a John Deere 833, his old Case IH equipment, staying behind as trade-ins worth $54,000. Morrison Equipment lost the deal without knowing it was available, lost it without a phone call or a question or even awareness that one of their 14-year customers was gone. Timothy didn't tell them why, didn't file a complaint, didn't write a letter. When Morrison's sales manager called 3 weeks later asking if Timothy wanted to look at the new Magnum models they had coming in, Timothy's answer was polite and brief. "We're good. I'll call if I need anything." He never called. If you'd been one of those farmers watching Bob Williams's auction, seeing a loyal customer lose $100,000 because a dealership threw away evidence, what would you have done? Timothy Clark answered. Within 6 weeks, 12 others would answer the same question over the next 5 months, each in their own time, each with their own calculation about whether staying with Morrison Equipment was worth the risk. Brian Thompson sat in the mechanics bay at Morrison Equipment and tried to focus on the hydraulic system he was diagnosing, a 2006 Magnum with intermittent pressure loss in the front loader circuit. Simple problem, probably just a worn seal in the control valve. The kind of repair he could do in his sleep after 9 years as Morrison's lead mechanic. But his mind kept drifting back to May, to the MX255 transmission laid out on his workbench, to the clutch plates that showed heat stress consistent with a manufacturing defect, not operator abuse, to the conversation with Donald Thomas where Brian had explained his findings and been overruled. Corporate's been pushing back on warranty claims. We need to be more careful about what we approve. Brian had pushed back. But Williams' maintenance logs are perfect. Every service on schedule. Every fluid spec correct. This isn't abuse. Donald's voice had been final. The decision's made. Dispose of the parts and write up the repair estimate. Brian had followed orders, had thrown away the transmission components that would have proven Bob Williams innocent, had written up the $11,300 repair as if it were the customer's fault instead of a quality control failure somewhere in Case IH's manufacturing process. He'd told himself it was just one decision, just one claim, that it wouldn't matter in the long run. Then Bob Williams had sold every Case IH machine he owned, and Brian understood it mattered more than he'd thought, not just to Bob. To every farmer who'd heard about it, to every Morrison customer who now wondered if their warranty would be honored or denied based on corporate pressure instead of mechanical reality. Brian finished the hydraulic repair, wrote up the work order, and went home. Told his wife he was thinking about changing jobs. She asked why, and he couldn't quite explain it. Something about choosing between doing the right thing and keeping your job. Something about how he'd made the wrong choice once and didn't want to be in a position to make it again. Early October, Brian gave his 2 weeks' notice, took a job at an independent repair shop in Hayes, 40 minutes from Sterling. Better commute than he'd prefer, but the shop's owner had a reputation for honest work and fair dealing. The kind of place where mechanics could tell customers the truth without worrying about corporate directives or quarterly warranty budgets. Morrison Equipment lost their best mechanic, had to hire someone new, someone who needed 3 months of training before he could handle the complex diagnostics Brian had done routinely. Service quality dropped. Wait times increased. Farmers started noticing. Small things, individually meaningless, but they added up. September brought James Smith's decision, though it arrived at a different angle than Timothy's had. James's 2004 MX-21 needed a fuel pump, out of warranty by 2 years, so no dispute about coverage. $1,890 for parts and labor. James paid without hesitation. Routine maintenance was just part of farming, and he'd budgeted for it. But when the service manager asked if James wanted to look at the new Magnum 290s on the lot, something in James resisted. He'd been planning to upgrade within the year. His operation was expanding 2,400 acres now, and he needed more horsepower. The Magnum 290 would have been perfect. Morrison had always given him fair trade-in value, good financing terms, solid service. But that was before Bob Williams sold his equipment, before the story spread about warranty denials and disposed evidence, before James started wondering if Morrison would treat him the same way if something went wrong with a new purchase. "Not right now," James heard himself say. The service manager pressed, gently. "Any particular reason? We've got some really competitive financing available." James couldn't quite articulate why he didn't want to commit. It wasn't rational. Morrison hadn't done anything wrong to him personally. He'd never had a warranty dispute, never been treated unfairly. By any objective measure, they'd been a good dealer for him over the years. But trust once questioned is hard to restore. And James had questions now that he hadn't had before Bob's auction. "Just not the right time. I'll let you know if that changes." October brought James to a New Holland dealership in Hoisington. Not because he particularly wanted New Holland equipment, not because they'd offered better prices or terms, simply because staying with Case IH meant continuing to do business with Morrison, and James no longer trusted that when something went wrong, and eventually something always went wrong with farm equipment, Morrison would treat him fairly. He traded his entire fleet, 3 tractors, 1 combine, 2 planters, $87,000 in trade-in value that Morrison never knew was available. The dealership lost the business without losing a customer because James didn't stop being a customer in any official way. He just stopped coming in. When Morrison's sales manager called to follow up on the Magnum 290 offer, James gave the same answer Timothy had given. "We're good. I'll call if I need anything." The pattern repeated. Ryan Robinson, 64 years old, Case IH customer since 1981. Switched to Kubota in September. $32,000 in trade-ins Morrison never saw. Edward Harris, 59, 2,100 acres, switched to AGCO in October. $71,000 in lost business. 5 more farmers between November 2009 and February 2010. All of them long-term Morrison customers. All of them quiet departures with polite excuses and non-committal promises to stay in touch. None of them filed complaints or explained their reasoning or gave Morrison Equipment any opportunity to win them back. They just stopped coming in. By February 2010, Morrison Equipment had lost 14 customers who'd been buying from them for an average of 22 years each. Combined trade-in value and new equipment purchases, approximately $890,000. Michael Johnson noticed the numbers but didn't understand them. He'd been general manager of Morrison Equipment since 2001, had built the dealership through the farm boom of the mid-2000s. In 2008, they'd posted their best year ever, $4.2 million in equipment sales, strong parts and service revenue, healthy margins across all departments. He'd been planning to open a second location in Great Bend, had already started preliminary talks with Case YH Corporate about territory expansion. Then, 2009 happened. Sales dropped to $3.1 million. Michael assumed it was the economy. Commodity prices had collapsed in late 2008. Credit was tight. Farmers were cautious. Made sense. The entire equipment industry was down. But 2010 didn't recover the way he'd expected. By spring, sales were tracking toward $2.4 million, down 43% from their 2008 peak. Parts and service revenue was down too, which shouldn't happen in a down market. When farmers can't buy new equipment, they typically spend more maintaining old equipment. Something was wrong, but Michael couldn't pinpoint it. His sales team reported that farmers seemed less interested in trade-ins, more likely to defer purchases, harder to pin down on commitments. His service department said appointment volume was down, that some regular customers hadn't been in for months. March 2010 brought Michael his first real clue, though he didn't recognize it immediately. A retiring farmer in Ellis County was selling his equipment, late model Case YH line, well-maintained, low hours. Michael drove out to observe the auction, thinking Morrison might bid on some pieces for their used inventory. Good equipment moved fast, and having quality used machines on the lot helped bring in customers who couldn't afford new. The auction drew a decent crowd, maybe 80 people, which was reasonable for a midweek sale. Michael watched the bidding with a practiced eye, evaluating prices, tracking which dealers were aggressive and which were holding back. The first major piece was a Magnum 305, 2006 model, 2,800 hours. Book value said it should bring around $140,000. Michael expected competitive bidding machine like that, with hours that low, should attract interest from multiple dealers and larger farming operations. Opening bid came in at $90,000, climbed slowly, 95, 100, 105, then stalled. The auctioneer worked the crowd trying to generate momentum, but nobody wanted to go higher. Sold at $98,000, $42,000 below book value. The 7010 combine went the same way. Should have brought $175, sold for $131. Michael watched piece after piece sell below market value and felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't normal depreciation. This wasn't conservative bidding in a down market. This was something else. Farmers and dealers actively avoiding Case YH equipment even when prices were heavily discounted. After the sale, Michael approached the auctioneer. They knew each other from previous sales, had a professional relationship built on years of transactions. What happened out there? Those prices were terrible. The auctioneer looked at Michael for a long moment, deciding how much to say. People are nervous about Case IH right now. Nervous about what equipment quality? You'd have to ask them. Michael didn't ask, but he started listening. The story that kept coming up was Bob Williams, not just from farmers who knew Bob personally, but from people 3 counties away who'd only heard about it secondhand. The details varied depending on the source. Some versions said the transmission had been denied because of wrong hydraulic fluid. Others mentioned pulling a chisel plow in muddy conditions. Some claimed Morrison had accused Bob of running the tractor past redline under load. but the core remained constant across every version. A 58-year-old farmer with 30 years of loyalty had been denied a warranty claim without documentation. The dealership had disposed of the damaged parts before the customer could inspect them. The farmer had paid an $11,300 repair bill, then sold every Case IH machine he owned and switched brands. And now other farmers were doing the same thing. Michael started pulling data: customer retention rates over the past 12 months, service appointment frequency, part sales to long-term accounts. The numbers told a story he didn't want to believe. Summer 2010 brought the full picture into focus. Sales projected at $2.4 million, down 43% from 2008. 14 long-term customers, farmers who'd been buying from Morrison for 15 to 35 years, had quietly disappeared from the customer list. No arguments, no complaints, just gone. August 2010. Michael called a meeting. Conference room, 10 in the morning, all department heads required. Donald Thomas arrived first, carrying a coffee and looking relaxed. Kenneth Lee came in reviewing something on his phone. Richard Miller brought a notepad, probably expecting to discuss inventory issues or parts ordering procedures. Michael waited until everyone was seated. Then he closed the door and asked the question that had been building in him for months. What happened with Bob Williams? The room went still. Donald set down his coffee carefully. Kenneth stopped looking at his phone. Richard's pen froze over his notepad. Donald spoke first, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he'd handled a situation correctly. Bob's MX255 transmission failed due to operator abuse, running fourth gear under heavy load without proper downshifting. We documented the failure, quoted the repair, customer paid it. Standard procedure. Michael's voice stayed level, almost conversational. Did we document the abuse specifically? Photos of the damage? No. The mechanic made the assessment based on the failure pattern. Which mechanic? Sir Brian Thompson. The mechanic who quit 3 months ago. Donald shifted in his chair. He left for personal reasons. Did Brian recommend denying the warranty? A pause, small but noticeable. He suggested it might be a manufacturing defect. I made the final call based on corporate guidelines about claim scrutiny. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. Why were the damaged parts disposed of before Williams could inspect them? Standard procedure to maintain shop efficiency. Show me the written policy that says we dispose of parts before the customer sees them. Donald couldn't, because there wasn't one. The decision to throw away Bob's transmission components hadn't been policy. It had been improvisation, designed to prevent the customer from challenging the denial. Michael turned to Kenneth. You called Bob after his auction catalog went out. What did he say? Kenneth looked uncomfortable. That the sale was firm. He wasn't interested in discussing trade-ins or new equipment. Did you ask why he was selling? He said he was switching brands. Did you ask which brand or why he was switching? He didn't want to discuss it. Michael pulled out a spreadsheet he'd prepared that morning, slid it across the table. 19 customers lost in the 13 months since Bob's warranty was denied. Average time with Morrison 22 years. Average trade-in value per customer $62,000. Average new equipment purchase per customer $95,000. Total estimated loss $1,740,000. Nobody spoke. The numbers sat on the table between them, irrefutable and devastating. Michael let the silence stretch. 5 seconds. 10, 15. Then he stood, walked to the whiteboard mounted on the conference room wall, picked up a marker, and wrote, saved $8,400, lost $1,740,000, ratio 1 to 207. He turned back to the table. We saved $8,400 by denying Bob Williams's warranty claim. We've lost $1.74 million in business since then. Anyone want to explain how that's good for the dealership? Kenneth tried. Michael, we didn't know this would happen. How could we predict that one warranty denial would... Michael cut him off. That's exactly the problem. We made a decision that saved us a transmission repair without thinking about what it might cost us in trust. Bob Williams wasn't just a customer. He was a 30-year reference. Every farmer in 3 counties knew him, knew his reputation, knew he took care of his equipment. When we denied his claim and threw away the evidence, we didn't just lose Bob. We lost everyone who wondered if they'd be next. Donald's voice carried an edge, now defensive. Corporate's been pushing us to reduce warranty costs. The directive came from regional. We were following policy. Show me the policy that says dispose of evidence before the customer can challenge the decision. Donald couldn't. The policy didn't exist. What existed was corporate pressure to reduce claims combined with local discretion about how to achieve that goal. Donald had chosen the path that saved money in the short term while destroying relationships in the long term. Michael sat back down, looked at each of them in turn. I'm calling Case IH Corporate tomorrow. We need help fixing what we broke. Donald's voice was quiet now. To tell them that we denied a warranty claim to a 30-year customer, disposed of the evidence, and lost 19 farmers because of it. That our sales are down 43%. That Case IH equipment is selling below book value at auctions because farmers don't trust the brand anymore. That we need policy changes and outreach support and probably some kind of customer win-back program. Kenneth asked the question they were all thinking. Will that bring them back? Michael looked at the spreadsheet, looked at the names of farmers who'd been buying from Morrison since before he'd started working there. Farmers his predecessor had sold to, farmers who'd built relationships that were supposed to last generations. I don't know, but we have to try. The meeting ended. Department heads filed out quietly. Michael sat alone in the conference room and thought about phone calls he needed to make. To Case IH Corporate in Racine, Wisconsin. To marketing about damage control. To his accountant about cash flow projections if sales didn't recover. But first, he thought about Bob Williams. 58 years old, 3 decades of loyalty, betrayed over $8,400. Michael wondered if Bob knew what his auction had triggered. Wondered if Bob had intended to create this domino effect, or if he'd just been making a personal statement that happened to resonate with other farmers facing the same calculation about whether their loyalty was valued or exploited. Probably didn't matter. Intent wasn't the point. Action was. Bob had acted. Other farmers had watched and learned and made their own choices. And now Morrison Equipment was bleeding customers and revenue while trying to understand how a single denied warranty claim could cost them $1,740,000. The mathematics of trust turned out to be crueler than anyone had anticipated, because trust isn't rebuilt with discounts or incentives or apologies. Trust is built slowly through years of fair dealing and kept promises and honoring your commitments even when it costs you something. And once broken trust is almost impossible to repair. Morrison Equipment was about to learn that lesson, but the education would come too late to save them. Outside the conference room, Donald Thomas walked to his office and closed the door, sat at his desk, and tried to process what had just happened. He'd made a decision in May 2009 that seemed reasonable at the time. Corporate wanted fewer warranty claims. Bob Williams's transmission showed damage consistent with hard use. The repair cost was significant. Denying the claim saved money and satisfied the directive from Regional. How was he supposed to know Bob would sell all his equipment? How was he supposed to predict that other farmers would care? How was he supposed to foresee that one decision would trigger a customer exodus that threatened the dealership's survival? The answer, uncomfortable and unavoidable, was that he should have known, should have understood that relationships built over decades can't be sacrificed for quarterly budget targets. Should have recognized that throwing away evidence wasn't standard procedure, it was covering up a questionable decision. Should have listened to Brian Thompson when the mechanic said the damage looked like a manufacturing defect. Should have done a lot of things differently, but hindsight offered no solutions, only the bitter recognition that he'd stepped over a dollar to pick up a dime, and that dime had cost the dealership more than he'd saved in 100 warranty denials. Kenneth Lee sat in his office and scrolled through his customer contact list. 19 names highlighted in red, farmers who'd left without explanation, who'd stopped returning calls, who'd given polite excuses and empty promises to stay in touch. He'd been calling them periodically, trying to win them back, offering trade-in incentives and financing deals. None of them had come back. None of them had even engaged in serious conversation. They were polite, respectful, grateful for the offers, but they weren't coming back. Kenneth understood why now. He'd been trying to solve a money problem with money solutions. But this wasn't about money. This was about trust. And you can't buy trust back with discounts, no matter how aggressive your offer. Richard Miller walked back to the parts department and thought about the conversation he'd had with Timothy Clark 4 months ago. The careful questions Timothy had asked, the non-answers Richard had given, the look on Timothy's face when he realized Morrison wasn't going to acknowledge what had happened to Bob Williams. Richard had known in that moment he was losing a customer, had known Timothy was going to leave. But what could Richard do? He was a parts manager, not a policymaker. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't reverse Donald's decision, couldn't offer anything except the truth, which was that Morrison Equipment had chosen $8,400 over 30 years of relationship. So Timothy had left, and James Smith had left, and 17 others had followed. And now the parts department's revenue was down because those farmers were buying their parts somewhere else, getting their service somewhere else, building new relationships with dealers who might not be better but at least hadn't proven themselves worse. The afternoon dragged on. Service techs worked on equipment. Salesmen made calls. Parts orders were processed. The dealership functioned the way it always had, the machinery of commerce grinding forward even as the foundation crumbled beneath it. By 5 o'clock, most employees had gone home. Michael sat alone in his office, lights off, looking out the window at the equipment lot. New Magnum tractors lined up in rows, paint gleaming in the late sun. Beautiful machines, powerful, well-engineered, everything a farmer could want, except trust. Trust didn't come with the tractor. Trust came from the dealer, and Morrison Equipment had squandered theirs on a decision that saved $8,400 and cost them everything that mattered. Michael pulled out his phone, looked at the contact information for Case YH Corporate. Tomorrow he'd make the call, explain the situation, ask for help. Maybe they'd have solutions. Maybe they'd send someone to assess the damage and recommend recovery strategies. Or Maybe they'd just send policy memos and training requirements and revised warranty procedures that would prevent future Bob Williamses but do nothing to bring back the 19 farmers who were already gone. Either way, Morrison Equipment had a problem that transcended anything Michael had dealt with in his 9 years as general manager. A problem that couldn't be solved with sales events or marketing campaigns or aggressive pricing. A problem that lived in the space between what farmers expected and what Morrison had delivered. That space had widened to a chasm, and Michael didn't know if there was any way to bridge it. Somewhere in that chasm, 19 farmers were building new relationships with new dealers, buying different equipment, learning different systems, starting over after decades of loyalty to a brand that had let them down. They weren't angry. Anger would have been easier to manage. Anger you could address with apologies and compensation and promises to do better. But these farmers weren't angry. They were just done trusting, done giving Morrison the benefit of the doubt, done investing emotional energy in a relationship that had proven itself conditional and transactional and fundamentally unequal. They had walked away quietly, the way people walk away from relationships that no longer serve them. No drama, no confrontation, just a calm recognition that staying was worse than leaving, even if leaving cost money and required starting over. Morrison Equipment was learning what it meant to lose customers who don't complain, customers who don't give you a chance to fix things, customers who just disappear into the landscape and take their business elsewhere and never look back. Those were the customers you couldn't win back, because they'd already done the hardest part. They'd made the decision to leave. And, having made that decision, having committed to it, having reorganized their operations around new equipment and new relationships, they had no reason to reverse course. The phone call to corporate would happen tomorrow. The policy reviews and training sessions would follow. Morrison Equipment would make changes, would implement better procedures, would try to ensure nothing like the Bob Williams situation ever happened again. But all of that was future-focused, preventive, designed to keep the next customer from leaving. It did nothing for the 19 who were already gone. And in a small town like Sterling, in a farm community where everyone knew everyone and word traveled fast, 19 lost customers meant 19 different stories circulating about Morrison Equipment. 19 cautionary tales, 19 reasons for other farmers to think twice before buying Case 1H equipment or trusting Morrison with their business. The damage was done. The question now was whether it could be contained or whether it would keep spreading until Morrison Equipment became a case study in how not to treat loyal customers. Michael suspected he already knew the answer, but he'd make the call to corporate anyway. Do his due diligence. Follow protocol. Try everything possible to save the dealership he'd spent 9 years building. And hope that somewhere, somehow, there was a way to fix what Donald Thomas had broken over a transmission that should have been covered under warranty and $8,400 that turned out to be the most expensive money Morrison Equipment had ever saved. The sun set over Sterling, Kansas. Lights came on in farmhouses across the county. Farmers finished evening chores and sat down to dinner with their families. Equipment sat idle in yards and sheds waiting for tomorrow's work. And in 19 of those farmhouses, Case IH equipment no longer had a place. Different colors now, different brands, different dealers, same farms, same families, same work, just different loyalties. Because loyalty once broken is almost never repaired. And Morrison Equipment had broken theirs spectacularly, publicly, and irreversibly. The story wasn't over. But the outcome was already written in the decisions 19 farmers had made over 13 months. Written in the $1,740,000 Morrison would never recover. Written in the empty spaces on their customer list where names had been for decades. Written in the quiet exodus of people who'd stopped believing their loyalty was valued, and there was no going back from that. Michael made the call to Racine, Wisconsin on the Monday following his conference room confrontation. The Case IH corporate office put him through to regional sales after 15 minutes on hold. He explained the situation as clearly as he could without sounding desperate. 19 customers lost over 13 months. Sales down 43% from peak. Used equipment selling below book value at auctions. A story circulating about warranty denials and disposed evidence. The regional manager listened without interrupting. When Michael finished, there was a pause that stretched 3 seconds too long. "We'll send someone." September 2010 brought David Jones to Sterling. 41 years old regional sales manager, 16 years with Case YH. He'd handled dealer issues before: financial restructuring, personnel conflicts, territory disputes. Standard corporate problems with standard corporate solutions. This situation felt different from the moment he reviewed Morrison's numbers on the flight from Milwaukee. A dealership doesn't lose 19 long-term customers in 13 months without something fundamental breaking. Money problems you could solve with financing. Personnel issues you could solve with terminations or training. But customer trust, once shattered, required something corporate solutions rarely provided: genuine acknowledgement of failure and meaningful change that went beyond policy memos. David spent his first day in Sterling reviewing Morrison's records, sales reports, service logs, customer retention data. The numbers told a story that matched Michael's phone summary, but seeing it laid out in spreadsheets and graphs made the scope clearer. The dealership was hemorrhaging revenue at a rate that would make them unprofitable within 18 months if the trend continued. Day 2. David visited 7 farms, talked to customers who'd stayed with Morrison, asked careful questions about their experience, listened for what they weren't saying. Every conversation eventually circled back to Bob Williams. Not because David brought it up, but because the farmers did. They mentioned it the way people mention weather before a tornado casually, but with underlying tension about whether they'd be next. "Bob's a good farmer, takes care of his equipment. If Morrison denied his warranty, they must have had a reason. But I never heard what that reason was exactly. Heard they threw away the parts before Bob could see them. That true? Timothy Clark switched to Deere. James Smith went to New Holland. Makes you think." David took notes, thanked them for their time, drove back to Morrison Equipment with a clearer picture of what he was dealing with. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be clarified. This was a breach of fundamental trust that had metastasized into community-wide skepticism about whether Morrison Equipment honored its commitments. Day 3. David drove out to Bob Williams's farm. The property sat 5 miles east of Sterling, 1,800 acres of wheat and corn, stretching toward a horizon broken only by occasional cottonwood windbreaks. David pulled into the gravel driveway at 9 in the morning, September heat already climbing toward 80. He could see the equipment shed from the driveway green paint now, where red and black had been 14 months ago. Bob was in the shop changing oil on a John Deere 781. Oh. Jason worked in the corner, adjusting chains on a planter. Susan stood at the house window, visible through the kitchen curtains, watching this corporate stranger arrive unannounced. David approached the shop slowly. Bob noticed him set down an oil filter, wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days. David introduced himself, explained who he was and why he'd come. "Mr. Williams, I'm David Jones from Case IH Corporate. I've been reviewing what happened with your MX255. Can we talk?" Bob looked at him for a long moment. 59 years old now, 1 year removed from the auction that had cost him $100,000 and triggered a customer exodus, Morrison still didn't fully understand. "Sure." They walked outside away from the shop noise, stood in the shade of a cottonwood while David explained his mission. He'd reviewed the warranty denial, studied the documentation, what little existed, talked to Morrison's staff, looked at the numbers. Case IH wanted to understand what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. Bob listened without expression. When David finished, Bob's response came quiet but precise. "There's not much to understand. Transmission failed. They said it was my fault. They threw away the parts before I could see them. I paid to fix it. Then I sold everything." "Did you try to appeal the decision?" "No." "Why not?" Bob's gaze moved across his farm, taking in the fields he'd worked for 40 years, the equipment that bore different colors, now the life he'd rebuilt after walking away from 3 decades of relationship. "Because the moment they threw away those parts, they made it clear they didn't want me to appeal. They wanted me to accept their decision and move on. So I did, just not the way they expected." David pulled out a folder. Inside was a new Case IH policy. Document printed 3 days ago in Racine. He handed it to Bob. "This wouldn't happen today. We've implemented new warranty procedures. All denials require photographic documentation, third-party mechanical analysis, corporate approval before any decision gets communicated to the customer." Bob glanced at the document without reading it. "That's good. For whoever's still buying from Morrison." The words landed with finality. David had been in sales long enough to recognize when a customer was truly lost versus just negotiating for better terms. Bob Williams wasn't negotiating. He was done. "Is there anything Case IH can do to earn your trust back?" Bob looked at David, really looked at him, trying to determine if this corporate representative genuinely wanted to understand or was just checking boxes on a damage control protocol. What Bob saw was a man doing his job, asking questions he'd been trained to ask, following procedures designed to contain problems and minimize future liability. "Mr. Jones, you're asking the wrong question. You should be asking why it took 19 customers leaving before you changed your policy. The answer is because $8,400 seemed like more money than 30 years of loyalty. That's not something you can fix with better procedures. That's something you have to live with." David tried different angles: compensation for the repair cost, trade-in incentives for new equipment, extended warranty coverage, a personal apology from Case YH's regional vice president. Every offer met the same calm refusal. "I don't want your money. I'm done trading with Case IH. Apologies don't rebuild trust. Actions do. And your actions already told me what I needed to know." "What would it take to bring you back?" Bob's answer came without hesitation. "There's nothing you can offer. This wasn't about money. It was about trust, and you can't buy that back." David left the Williams farm, understanding his mission had failed before it started. He'd been sent to assess whether Bob Williams could be recovered as a customer. The answer was no, definitively and permanently. Bob had made his decision, paid the cost, reorganized his entire operation around that decision. Reversing course would accomplish nothing except proving he could be manipulated with incentives which would undermine the very principle he'd sacrificed $100,000 to defend. David spent his final afternoon in Sterling writing his report, sat in a Morrison Equipment conference room with his laptop, translating observations into corporate language. Customer unrecoverable. Relationship damage severe and irreversible. Reputation impact significant across 3-county area. Recommended actions, policy implementation, complete dealer training scheduled, but customer recovery unlikely for affected accounts. He called Michael in before he left, handed over a printed copy of his report. Corporates sending you a formal policy letter within the week. Training requirements for all service staff. New warranty procedures are mandatory as of November 1st. Michael scanned the report, saw the recommendation that made his chest tighten. Customer recovery unlikely. Is corporate planning to reach out to Bob Williams directly, offer compensation or formal apology? David's expression gave the answer before his words did. That's not part of the current plan. Why not? Because we can't fix what already happened. We can only prevent it from happening again. Michael understood the logic. Corporate organizations didn't apologize because apologies implied legal liability. They implemented policy changes because policies were defensible and procedural. They trained staff because training could be documented and measured. But they didn't chase after departed customers with mea culpas and restitution because that suggested fault and opened doors to litigation. The practical approach. The corporate approach. The approach that saved money and minimized risk and did absolutely nothing to repair the actual damage. The 19 who left aren't coming back, are they? David closed his laptop, stood to leave. His voice carried the weariness of someone who'd delivered this message before in different contexts. No, they're not. You might slow the bleeding, might even stabilize your numbers at some lower level. But those specific customers, they're done. Best thing you can do is make sure the next 19 don't have the same reason to leave. He left for the airport. Michael sat alone in the conference room with a policy document that arrived too late to save his dealership and a recommendation that customer recovery was unlikely. The words felt like a death sentence delivered in bureaucratic language. October 2010 brought the formal letter from Case YH Corporate. 3 pages printed on corporate letterhead signed by a regional vice president Michael had never met. The language was precise and impersonal. Warranty denial procedures under review. Photographic documentation now mandatory. Third-party mechanical analysis required for all denials exceeding $5,000 in estimated repair costs. Corporate approval needed before communicating warranty denials to customers. Morrison Equipment staff required to attend dealer training seminar on warranty compliance scheduled for January 2011 in Kansas City. What the letter didn't include was mentioned nowhere in its 3 pages. No acknowledgement that Morrison had made a mistake. No apology to Bob Williams or any other customer. No compensation offer. No outreach plan to customers who'd left. No recognition that 19 families had walked away from decades of relationship because a dealership had chosen policy over people. Just procedures, training requirements, corporate oversight, all of it designed to prevent future problems while doing nothing about current damage. Michael called David Jones. Corporate's not reaching out to Bob or the others who left. Not part of the plan. Can't fix what's already broken. can only prevent breaking more things. The logic was sound in a vacuum. In the real world of Sterling, Kansas, where farmers talked to each other and reputation mattered, and broken trust poisoned everything, downstream, the logic was catastrophic. Because every farmer who heard that Case IH had changed their policies but hadn't apologized to Bob Williams learned the same lesson Bob had learned. Corporate cared about protecting themselves, not about making customers whole. Michael decided to try anyway. If corporate wouldn't reach out, he would. Personal calls from the general manager, not sales pitches, not promotions, just honest conversations acknowledging what had happened and asking what it would take to rebuild trust. January 2011 brought a new service manager to replace Donald Thomas, who'd resigned under pressure in November. The new hire came from a Great Bend dealership with a strong reputation for customer service. Michael implemented the corporate warranty procedures, immediately trained all staff, established direct oversight of any denial over $2,000. Then he started making calls. Timothy Clark answered on the third ring. Michael kept his voice conversational, stripped of sales technique. "Timothy, this is Michael Johnson from Morrison. I wanted to talk to you about what happened last year with Bob Williams and our warranty procedures." Timothy's response came careful, guarded. "All right. We made mistakes. The way we handled Bob's situation was wrong. We've changed our procedures. New service manager, corporate oversight on denials. I wanted you to know that what happened to Bob wouldn't happen now." Silence on the line. 5 seconds. 7. "I appreciate the call, Michael. Good to know you made changes. Would you consider coming back? We could offer 10% over book value on any trade-in, 0% financing for 36 months, free service for the first year on any new equipment." More silence. Then Timothy's voice, gentle but final. "Thanks for the offer, Michael, but I'm good with Deere now. Equipment's working well. Service has been solid. Don't really have a reason to switch back. Even with the incentives. It's not about incentives. It's about knowing that if something goes wrong, the dealer will back me up. I had that with Morrison for 14 years. Then I saw what happened to Bob and realized maybe I didn't have it as much as I thought. Deere's given me that confidence now. Don't see a reason to risk losing it again." The call ended politely. Michael marked Timothy's name off his list and moved to the next one. James Smith gave almost identical answers, appreciated the call, acknowledged the changes, declined the offers. "Know you're trying, Michael, but the trust is gone. Nothing personal. Just can't see going back." Call after call, 19 names, 19 conversations that started with hope and ended with polite refusals. Some farmers were friendlier than others. Some acknowledged the difficulty of Michael's position, but none of them came back. By March 2011, Michael had exhausted his outreach. 0 returns out of 19 attempts. The customers were gone, and no amount of incentives or apologies or procedural changes would bring them back. Sales continued declining. 2.1 million in 2011, 1.8 in 2012. The dealership was dying slowly, bleeding customers and revenue, while Case IH Corporate sent supportive memos and training materials that did nothing to address the fundamental problem. People didn't trust Morrison equipment anymore, and without trust, all the policies and procedures and incentives in the world meant nothing. Years passed. The story faded from active conversation, but never disappeared entirely. Became part of Sterling's collective memory, the kind of cautionary tale older farmers told younger ones, about loyalty and betrayal, about corporations, and customers about the day Bob Williams sold his equipment and started something he probably never intended, a quiet referendum on whether Morrison Equipment deserved the trust their customers had given them. 13 of those 19 customers made their ruling. Not guilty, not trustworthy, not worth the risk. Spring 2018 brought Jason Williams to a crossroads he didn't initially recognize. 33 years old now, farming full-time with his father, increasingly handling major decisions as Bob slowed down. 67 now, still active, but no longer carrying the physical load he'd managed at 58. Jason had proven himself capable, had modernized parts of the operation, had built relationships with suppliers and buyers and agronomists. But equipment decisions still belonged to Bob. Always had, Jason suggested. Bob decided. 9 years of that pattern, and Jason had accepted it as natural division of responsibility. Until Case IH released the Magnum 380. 380 horsepower, CVT transmission, GPS, guided steering, auto steer capable, one of the most powerful row crop tractors on the market. Specifications that made Jason's pulse quicken when he read them. Their current largest tractor was a 2014 Deere 8420 solid machine, but showing age at 4,000 hours. The Magnum 380 would give them more capacity, better fuel efficiency technology that would reduce operator fatigue during long days. The dealer in Great Bend, 94 miles from Sterling, the closest Case IH dealer after Morrison closed, was offering aggressive trade-in incentives. $45,000 for the 8420, which was strong given its hours and age. Jason approached his father during lunch on a Wednesday. Bob was eating a sandwich at the kitchen table, reviewing grain prices on his laptop. Jason had printouts, specifications, trade-in offer, financing terms. "Dad, have you seen the new Magnum 380? It's the most powerful row crop tractor Case IH has ever made. Really impressive specs." Bob glanced at the printout without picking it up. "Saw it? Should we at least look at it? Great Bend dealers offering $45,000 trade on our 8420. That's a really good number." "No." The finality stopped Jason cold. Not "let me think about it," or "maybe later," or "show me the numbers." Just no. "Why not? That's objectively a good deal. Better than we'd get on another Deere trade." Bob set down his sandwich, looked at his son. 9 years Jason had been farming with him full-time. 9 years of working together, making decisions together, building the operation. But there were things Bob had never explained. Stories he'd never told. History. Jason didn't fully understand because he'd been 24 in 2009 and focused on learning farming, not paying attention to dealership relationships. "We're good with what we've got." Jason felt frustration rising. He wasn't 24 anymore, wasn't a kid who accepted his father's decisions without understanding. "Dad, I'm not saying we buy it tomorrow, just that we should look, compare options, make an informed decision." "The decision's already made. We don't buy Case YH. Because of what happened in 2009? Bob's expression shifted, surprised that Jason had made the connection. "You remember that. I remember you sold all our equipment that summer. Remember the auction. Remember you switched to Deere. But you never really explained why." "Thought it was obvious." "Not to me. I was 24, trying to learn how to farm, didn't really understand the dealership side of things." Bob stood, walked to the window, looked out at their equipment, all Deere, different shades of green and yellow than the red and black that had dominated the yard through Jason's childhood. Morrison denied a warranty claim they should have covered. threw away the evidence before I could prove them wrong, made it clear that 30 years of loyalty didn't matter when there was money on the line. So I left. That was 9 years ago. Morrison's closed. Different dealers now. Corporate changed their policies. Policies don't rebuild trust, and Case IH had their chance to make things right. They chose procedures over people, not doing business with them again. Jason wanted to argue, wanted to point out that judging current dealers by past failures wasn't rational. That equipment should be evaluated on specs and price, not old grudges, that they were potentially leaving value on the table because of something that happened when Jason was barely old enough to understand farming economics. But he looked at his father's face and understood something deeper was involved. This wasn't about equipment or dealers or even money. This was about principle, about the lesson Bob had paid $100,000 to learn and refused to forget. Jason gathered his printouts. "All right, we'll stick with deer." "Good." The conversation ended, but Jason's curiosity didn't. That evening after chores, he found his mother in her office. Susan was reviewing tax documents, preparing for quarterly estimates. She looked up when Jason knocked on the doorframe. "Mom, can I ask you something about 2009? Susan set down her pen. She'd been waiting 9 years for Jason to ask these questions. Wondered sometimes if he'd ever connect the dots. Wondered if Bob would ever tell the story himself, or if it would remain one of those family mysteries that younger generations never fully understood. "What do you want to know? Why won't Dad even consider Case IH? I know Morrison denied his warranty and he sold the equipment. But there are other dealers now. Corporate changed their procedures. Why hold on to it?" Susan considered her answer carefully. Jason was 33, not 24, old enough to understand complexity, old enough to recognize that some decisions weren't about economics or logic. It wasn't just the warranty denial, it was what Morrison did after. She told him the full story. The MX255 transmission failure, the warranty denial for operator abuse, the parts thrown away before Bob could inspect them, the $11,300 Bob paid knowing it was wrong, the quiet decision to sell everything, the auction where equipment sold below value, the $100,000 loss, then the part Jason hadn't known, the 18 farmers who'd watched, the 13 who'd left Morrison over the following months, the domino effect Bob's decision had triggered, the way Morrison equipment had bled customers until they couldn't sustain operations and closed in 2015. Morrison closed because of Dad. Susan shook her head. Morrison closed because they chose $8,400 over 30 years of trust. Your father just showed them what that choice cost. Corporate had a chance to make it right. Send someone to apologize. Compensate the repair. Acknowledge they'd made a mistake. They sent policy memos instead. Told your father they couldn't fix what was broken, only prevent breaking new things. That told him everything he needed to know about what customers meant to them. Jason sat quietly processing. So it's not about grudges. It's about what kind of business relationship he wants to have. Exactly. Your father learned that loyalty only matters when both sides honor it. Case IH Corporate proved they didn't honor it. Why would he give them another chance? Jason thought about the Magnum 380, about the specifications and the trade-in offer and the potential efficiency gains. Thought about how all of that was irrelevant against the principle his father had defended. Some things mattered more than getting the best deal or the newest technology. Things like dignity and self-respect, and refusing to do business with organizations that treated loyalty as conditional. He never brought up Case YH again. If you'd watched Bob Williams learn that loyalty has a price $8,400 and 30 years, how would you measure what was lost? Is trust counted in years or dollars? Or in something that can never be replaced once it's broken? Summer 2021 brought Angela Young to Bob's door. Journalist, early 40s, working on a feature article about dealer loyalty in the Midwest agricultural equipment market. She'd heard about the Morrison equipment closure from industry sources, had tracked down the Bob Williams story through interviews with other farmers, wanted to get Bob's perspective for her piece. Bob almost refused the interview. He'd moved on from 2009, had built a good relationship with his dear dealer in Hayes, had no interest in rehashing old grievances. But Angela was persistent and respectful, made it clear she wasn't writing a hit piece or looking for drama. Just trying to understand why longtime customers leave dealers and what that says about trust in agricultural commerce. They talked on his front porch on a June afternoon. Temperature pushing 90, humidity making the air feel heavier. Susan brought out iced tea and then disappeared back into the house, giving them privacy. Angela started with soft questions. How long had Bob been farming? What equipment did he run? How did he choose dealers? Bob answered patiently, recognizing where the conversation was headed, but willing to let it develop naturally. Eventually, Angela reached the real question. I've heard from several sources that you left Case IH in 2009 because of a warranty dispute. Would you be willing to talk about that? Bob looked out at his fields, 70 years old now, thinking about retirement in 5 years, looking at a lifetime of decisions and their consequences. No. Was it because of the warranty denial? Bob's voice came quiet, measured. Not angry, just tired. It wasn't about the money. Then what was it about? Long pause. Bob sipped his tea, watched a hawk circling over the south quarter. Finally, it was about the parts they threw away. Angela didn't understand. Bob explained, the words coming slowly as he walked her through something he'd spent 12 years processing. When they denied the claim, I could have fought it, could have hired a lawyer, could have filed a complaint with corporate. But the moment they threw away the transmission parts, they made it clear they didn't want me to fight. They wanted me to accept their decision and move on. That told me everything I needed to know about what I was worth to them after 30 years. Angela scribbled notes. Have you ever regretted leaving? No, but I regret it took me 30 years to realize loyalty only matters when both sides honor it. The words hung in the humid air. Angela recognized she'd just heard something quotable, something that captured the essence of her entire article. Would you ever consider buying Case IH again? Bob smiled, not unkindly. I'm 70, retiring in 5 years, so no. The article, published 3 months later in Farm Equipment magazine, 8,000 words about dealer loyalty, customer retention, the economics of trust. Bob's quote about loyalty ran as a pull quote on page 3, set in larger type against a photo of empty farmland. The piece went viral in agricultural communities, got picked up by trade publications, business blogs, dealership training programs. Case IH corporate read it. Morrison Equipment's former staff read it. Farmers across the Midwest read it and recognized their own experiences in Bob's story. Angela Young won an industry journalism award. Bob ignored the attention. He'd said his piece lived his principles, built the life he wanted. The article changed nothing for him, but it changed something for the industry. Made dealers think twice about warranty denials. Made corporate offices reconsider whether short-term savings justified long-term relationship damage. made farmers more confident in demanding fair treatment, knowing they weren't alone in walking away when trust broke. Small changes, incremental shifts, but real. Bob Williams had done more than leave Case IH. He'd created a case study in the cost of broken trust. And the lesson resonated beyond Sterling, beyond Kansas, beyond the specific facts of one denied warranty claim. The lesson was universal. When you measure loyalty in dollars instead of decades, you lose both. Morrison Equipment learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Their decline from 2010 through 2014 was steady and irreversible. 2.1 million in sales became 1.8, then 1.5, then 1.2. Parts revenue dropped as former customers serviced their non-Case IH equipment elsewhere. The dealership cut staff, reduced inventory, consolidated operations. Michael Johnson fought to keep them afloat, tried every strategy he knew. Aggressive promotions, extended warranties, trade-in incentives, personal outreach to every potential customer. Nothing worked. The reputation damage was too severe, the trust too broken, the alternatives too attractive. May 2015 brought the decision Michael had been avoiding for months. The dealership was losing money every quarter. Lease renewal was coming up. Case IH Corporate wouldn't subsidize a failing location. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Sterling location had to close. Michael made the announcement to his 9 remaining staff members on a Monday morning, gave them 60 days' notice, promised to help them find positions at other dealerships or in related industries. Most had been with Morrison for a decade or more, knew the closure wasn't Michael's fault, wasn't anyone's fault except the ghost of Donald Thomas and a warranty decision made 6 years ago. The final week came in early June. Tuesday through Thursday, they held a liquidation sale. Remaining inventory tools, shop equipment, office furniture, everything sold at deep discounts to dealers and farmers who recognized quality equipment even if they no longer trusted the dealer selling it. Friday, June 12, 2015. Last day, 4 customers came in for parts. None of them longtime loyalists. None of them people who remembered when Morrison Equipment had been Sterling's agricultural hub. Michael sat in his office at 4 o'clock, 1 hour before official closing, looked at the empty showroom where Magnum tractors had once gleamed under fluorescent lights, remembered 2008, best year ever, 4.2 million in sales, plans to expand, dreams of building something that would outlast him. Then he remembered May 2009. Donald Thomas making a decision that saved $8,400, parts thrown away. Bob Williams paying a bill that shouldn't have been his. An auction that triggered a slow-motion collapse. Michael pulled out a calculator, did the math one final time. Saved $8,400. Lost $1,740,000 in customer trade-ins and sales, 2009 to 2010. Lost $3,100,000 plus in subsequent sales, 2011 to 2014. Lost building inventory jobs, reputation, 47 years of history. Total cost of the decision to save $8,400, approximately $5 million, and a dealership that would never reopen. Michael locked the door for the final time at 5:15. The Case IH sign came down the following Monday. The building sold 3 weeks later to a farm supply company that converted it into a feed and fence post warehouse. No equipment sales, no service bays, no dealer relationship, just empty space where Morrison equipment used to exist. Nearest Case IH dealer, Great Bend, 94 miles from Sterling, too far for most Sterling farmers to justify the drive for parts or service. Bob Williams still drove past the building occasionally, saw the farm supply sign where Morrison Equipment's name had hung for 47 years, felt nothing, no satisfaction, no vindication, just recognition that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences compound over years until they become irreversible. Timothy Clark died in 2020 at 72. Natural causes, heart failure, surrounded by family. His son Scott took over the 1,200 acres, kept running Deere equipment. When asked if he'd ever consider switching back to Case YH, Scott's answer came without hesitation. Never asked my father why he left. No, he had a reason. That's good enough. James Smith retired in 2019, sold his 2,400 acres to an agricultural corporation that operated a mixed fleet. Case IH Deere, New Holland AGCO. Equipment chosen by efficiency metrics and maintenance costs, not loyalty or history. The corporation's farm manager asked James for advice before finalizing equipment purchases. James's recommendation was simple. Whatever you do, don't screw with warranty claims. Costs more than you save. Of the 19 farmers who left Morrison between 2009 and 2010, only 2 ever returned to Case YH. Both bought used equipment from out-of-state dealers. Neither bought from Kansas dealers. Neither trusted the brand enough to commit fully. The other 17 either retired, died, or continued farming with other brands. Their children inherited farms and equipment colors, and sometimes the stories about why their fathers had switched. Those stories became part of family history, passed down like land titles and water rights. Susan Williams turned 70 in 2020, still managed farm finances, still kept meticulous records, still remembered the conversation in the old shed when Bob decided to sell everything. "Your father didn't make that decision from anger," she told Jason when he asked about it years later. "He made it from clarity, saw exactly what he was worth to Morrison, and acted accordingly." Jason Williams reached 38 in 2023. Would inherit the farm when Bob fully retired. Had never bought Case IH equipment, probably never would. Some lessons get passed down through generations. This was one of them. Mark Anderson's Deere dealership in Hutchinson grew 40% between 2009 and 2015, gained 7 of Morrison's lost customers, including Timothy Clark and Bob Williams, built reputation on fair dealing and honoring commitments, never advertised the Morrison situation, never exploited their misfortune, just made sure farmers who left Morrison had somewhere trustworthy to go. Didn't take their customers, Mark explained to a business reporter in 2016. They left on their own. I made sure they had somewhere fair to land. 2022 brought a new Case IH customer loyalty program, designed to rebuild trust with former customers who'd left the brand. Trade-in incentives, extended warranties, dedicated support lines, personal account managers. Marketing materials emphasized listening to customers, honoring relationships, valuing loyalty. Bob received an invitation letter, threw it away without reading past the first paragraph. Too late. 2023 brought academic research. University of Nebraska study on dealer loyalty in Midwest agricultural equipment markets. Key finding 73% of farmers who leave a brand after a warranty dispute never return, even if the dispute is later resolved in their favor. Reasons cited most frequently: wasn't anger, wasn't even money. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of having to fight for what should have been honored automatically. The exhaustion of realizing loyalty is conditional until tested. The exhaustion of knowing 3 decades of business can be erased by one decision to save $8,400. Rural communities have a phrase for that kind of decision: stepped over a dollar to pick up a dime. Morrison Equipment saved $8,400 in May 2009, lost $1,740,000 in the following 18 months, lost $3,100,000 more over the subsequent 4 years, lost their building, their reputation, their legacy, all because someone decided that $8,400 was worth more than 30 years of trust. The mathematics proved otherwise, but by the time Morrison understood, the lesson came too late to save them. Spring 2024. Bob Williams turned 74, still farming his 1,800 acres, though Jason handled most of the physical work now. Bob supervised, advised, made the occasional decision about crop rotations or equipment timing, planning to fully retire within 2 years, hand everything over to Jason, and spend his remaining years watching the operation he'd built continue under younger leadership. Still ran Deere equipment exclusively. Still remembered June 2009, not with anger, but with clarity about what the experience had taught him. Not bitterness, just understanding about how relationships work and what happens when one side values loyalty more than the other. The 2005 Case IHMX 255 was still running somewhere. Bob occasionally wondered about it. The tractor that had started everything, that had revealed Morrison's true priorities, that had cost him $100,000 and triggered a chain reaction that closed a dealership. Last Bob heard, the MX255 had been sold twice since the Nebraska farmer bought it at auction. Second owner put another 6,000 hours on it. Third owner added 3,200 more. Total hours now exceeded 14,000. The transmission that Morrison claimed had failed due to operator abuse had never failed again. 14,000 hours without failure. Proof, if anyone needed it, that the original diagnosis had been wrong, that Bob's maintenance had been correct, that Morrison's warranty denial had been unjustified. But Bob didn't need proof. He'd known in May 2009 that he hadn't abused the equipment. The parts thrown away had confirmed not his guilt, but Morrison's unwillingness to let truth interfere with budget targets. He'd paid the $11,300 not because he owed it, but because fighting would have required trusting the same people who'd already shown they didn't value his trust. Better to pay leave and rebuild somewhere else than to fight a battle where the rules were rigged against him. Sometimes the quietest responses carry the most weight. Bob's response to Morrison's betrayal had been nearly silent. No lawyers, no complaints to corporate, no public protests, just an auction, a brand switch, and a life rebuilt with different equipment colors. Yet that quiet response had spoken louder than any argument could have. 19 farmers had heard it, understood it, made their own decisions based on what they'd witnessed. Morrison Equipment had heard it too, eventually. But by then the message was irreversible. Have you ever walked away from a business because of broken trust? Have you seen loyalty tested and fail? The story of Bob Williams and Morrison Equipment asks a question every relationship eventually faces: when trust breaks, can anything repair it? Or are some betrayals so fundamental that the only response is to walk away and never look back? Share your experience. Sometimes the most powerful responses are the quiet ones, and those stories matter. Bob still drove past the old Morrison Equipment building sometimes, farm supply warehouse now, fence posts stacked where tractors used to sit, feed bags where parts counters used to stand. No trace remaining of the dealership that had served Sterling for 47 years. He didn't stop to look, didn't feel satisfaction or vindication or even closure. Just drove past, noted the change kept moving, because forward was the only direction that mattered. The past was settled, the lessons learned, the principles defended. Life continued measured, not in equipment colors or dealership relationships, but in acres planted, crops harvested, seasons turned. Bob Williams had paid $8,400 and 30 years to learn that loyalty only matters when both sides honor it. Morrison Equipment had paid $5 million and their existence to learn the same lesson. One lesson. Two very different costs. The difference was this Bob had chosen his cost, knowingly had paid it willingly, had walked away whole. Morrison had stumbled into their cost, unknowingly had paid it, gradually had lost everything. In the end, the mathematics were simple. Trust once broken is almost never repaired, and the cost of breaking it is always more than you saved by betraying it. Morrison Equipment was gone. Bob Williams was still farming. The lesson lived in both outcomes. Some things are worth more than money. Some things are worth walking away to preserve. Some things like dignity and self-respect and the knowledge that you won't accept being valued less than your worth are worth defending no matter what it costs. Bob Williams had defended those things. The cost had been $100,000 and 9 years of rebuilding. But he'd kept what mattered most: his principles, his self-respect, his certainty that he'd done the right thing even when the right thing was expensive. Morrison Equipment had chosen differently, had valued $8,400 over 30 years of relationship, had lost everything in the process. The story was complete. The account settled, the lesson taught. All that remained was memory, and the empty building where Morrison Equipment used to stand, and the farmers who drove past it and remembered why trust matters and what happens when it breaks. Bob Williams drove past that building one last time in spring 2024. Didn't slow down, didn't look twice, just kept driving, headed home to the farm he'd built and the life he'd chosen and the principles he'd never compromised. The building faded in his rearview mirror. Gone, forgotten, irrelevant. He kept driving.